Welcome to the Whitlam Institute's webinar to launch our new research paper, PNG Voices, Listening to Australia's Closest Neighbour. We're joined here by people from right across Australia and right across the Pacific. It's lovely to have you all together. I'm joining you from the Whitlam Institute's home on the banks of the Parramatta River in what is now known as Western Sydney. These lands on which we sit have been cared for by the Darug peoples, whose custodianship extends over tens of thousands of years. The Darug elders have never ceded their connections to and their responsibilities for these lands. I acknowledge, on behalf of us all, the traditional owners of these lands. I pay our respect to their elders past and present. The elders have been gracious and generous to us here at the Whitlam Institute, and I thank them for their welcome to their lands. I acknowledge, of course, the lands on which others may be sitting at this time. I was struck when I first read this report at just how powerful and illuminating are its insights. The report is unique in its scale. 536 citizens from 21 of Papua New Guinea's 22 provinces contributed, and rich by virtue of its determination that the research would be conducted in PNG with PNG researchers who are trusted and equipped to converse in the relevant language. It's a credit to Leonie Baptiste, who's struggling at the moment to join us here, Dr. Landari Yamrak, and the extensive team in Papua New Guinea with Dr. Hannah Savasi here at Western Sydney University, who has been supported by Dr. Andrea Connor, the Whitlam Institute's Acting Policy and Research Manager. The release of the report this week could not be more timely. Of course, here in Australia particularly, we cannot help but be aware of the political furor that has erupted over the developments in the Solomon Islands. The relevance of this report is that it just demonstrates not only the importance of listening, but the critical importance of humility and respect alongside methodological rigour in the conversation. You will note when you get a chance to read the report that it does not put forward recommendations. This was a matter of considerable discussion, and the research team was absolutely determined to present and not overlay what they were hearing. They were right. The lessons from this research for diplomacy, bilateral partnership and collaboration, and for future research are all clear from the people themselves. As I suggest in the foreword, the report makes for sober reading. While we can take heart from the report's findings that respondents were largely positive about Australia, it would be both foolish and disservice to our neighbours if we were not properly to listen to what they have said and to deliberate on what it might mean for our official relationship, the aid we as Australians offer, the attitudes we bring to the table, and the depth of our understanding. This work was initiated by the former director here at the Institute, Leanne Smith, under the Institute's Australia and the World program. It could not be a more fitting exercise for this institute. Gough Whitlam's interest in Papua New Guinea can be traced back to his wartime experiences, but his unwavering determination to end Australia's colonial ties and supporting PNG independence is evident from the time of his first speech on foreign policy, a speech he gave as the member for Werriwa in 1953. He was a persistent advocate and regular visitor to PNG throughout his years in opposition. Whitlam came to government in 1972 with his party's commitment to wholehearted cooperation with the New Guinea House of Assembly to achieve its timetable for self-government and independence. The Whitlam government, thankfully, survived long enough for PNG's independence to be realised on September 16, 1975. This was a matter of enduring pride for Gough. I'll hand over now to our speakers, Dr. Hannah Savasi from the Marx Institute here at Western Sydney University, Research Coordinator for the PNG Voices project, and our special guests this evening, and I couldn't be more pleased to have them on this webinar this evening. In PNG, Dr. Landari Yamrak and Leonie Baptiste. As I say, we're hoping Leonie will still be able to join us. Dr. Landari is from the PNG University of Technology and Leonie from Divine Word University, both of whom are the lead researchers on the PNG Voices report. And we're also being joined shortly by Ian Kemish, who is a former Australian High Commissioner to PNG and is currently with the Lowy Institute and chair of the Concoda Foundation. It promises to be a great evening. Hannah, over to you.
Thanks so much, Eric, and thank you to everyone who's joining us tonight. And I'd also like to put out a special thanks to all of the additional 12 researchers in PNG and one researcher here at Western Sydney University who also played very big roles in this research. And we couldn't fit them all in the webinar tonight, but some of them are listening. So thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be able to launch this report and share some of the research findings and key messages with the audience tonight. I would, however, emphasize that our message is nuanced and complex, and I'd really beseech all of you, I beg all of you to read the report in its entirety. It's not that long, but it is complex and it is nuanced. And it also contains dozens and dozens of direct quotes from the people who participated in the research. So please hear their voices, hear our voices a bit, but hear their voices. So thank you for going ahead and reading the report after you participate in this webinar. I'd like to start with some very brief background about the broad aims of the research and how it's conducted before we go into discussion of some of the findings. This research project was about listening to some diverse voices within PNG, and we can't make any representativeness for a country with hundreds and hundreds of cultural and linguistic groups. So it was about listening to some of those voices and letting them come through. We attempted this in the age of COVID through a variety of methods. We had an online survey, freely accessible online survey, in-person surveys, including one in a remote community that reached 120 people in their own language, administered by their peers, community members, focus group discussions, and many, many interviews, which were headed up by Dr. Londari Yamarak, who's here today. We wanted to capture the perspectives of a wide swath of people about how they felt, what they were proud of, what their community's challenges were, what they hoped for their community's future and for the future of PNG, and also how they viewed Australia's relationship with PNG and other actors' relationship with PNG. So this research was conceived to give voice to people who are not often heard, but also to offer up those voices to policymakers here in Australia, others working with PNG and business development assistance, et cetera, so that they could hear a different kind of conversation, different voices that they might not always hear, saying things they might not always hear, especially in more official forums. It was really important for this research that the research project be co-designed and conducted by Papua New Guinean researchers. So again, we had 14 collaborators in various parts of the country, Madang, Ley, Port Moresby, a remote community. And it's lovely that we have at least Dr. Yamarak here tonight. Hopefully Ms. Baptiste will join us as well. We achieved some geographical reach. So 87% of Papua New Guineans live in rural and remote communities, and we wanted to be able to get those voices, capture those voices. A lot of those voices would not be heard through an online survey, so we went to them in person in their own language. To our knowledge, this is the first time that an Australian institution at least has collaborated in such an endeavor. And we're quite pleased with the 536 respondents who did participate in the research, given the challenges of transport in PNG, data costs, and of course, COVID-19. So tonight, I think we'd like to draw out and discuss some of the common the key findings and common messages, themes that emerged from the research. And I'll start with asking Dr. Yamarak. Londari, let's start in sort of draw out some of these findings for the audience tonight. I guess the very first thing to discuss is let's start from a place of pride. What did people say when they were asked about their communities? What do you value about your community or your province? They were asked. What were some of the things that they valued?
One of the very important, when you look at the findings of the research, one of the very important things that Papua New Guineans take pride, based on the response, was about the resources that they have, especially the land. Okay, most of them actually talked about having land as very important part of them, because they say that everything that they depend on comes from the land. So that's where most of them actually spoke highly of land being, that they take pride in that. So, and then on the land, then you have a look at some of the response, like they love flowers, and they love the rainforest, and they love the places. It's, when you look at it, it all comes under the category of where land. So it's one of the very important thing that most of the respondents in Ley as well as in the Morobe, the rural, say that it is very important to them, and they take pride in them, and also their people as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Landry. That's right. So as you said in the very end, that was one of the very few things, in fact, where there was a real common thread between that very remote sample, those 120 remote villagers, and the urban and educated respondents around the country. So definitely the valuing the land and natural resources. In particular, those rural people, it was so touching to me that actually they, more than half of those remote villagers, they actually said they said clean water, right? And then the second thing that they mentioned was actually flowers, that they took pride in the flowering plants and flowering trees, sort of the beauty of their forest, not just that they could use it for economic reasons, right? Landry, what about this notion, I guess, the big commonality across that remote sample and then the educated and urban samples was this notion of the PNG way. Could you expand on that a little bit, this sort of way of relating that was valued by people, respectfulness, etc.? Could you briefly elaborate?
Yeah, it's common knowledge when some of the questions that when you ask them, the hospitality, the welcoming spirit they have, even though they have nothing in the house to welcome them, but the willingness to go out and help them, willing respectfully. That's one of the important things that they talked about in almost all of those. So it's kind of a caring and sharing and all these things. That's one important point actually they made a mention of.
Yeah, thank you. So moving from that place of what people prized about their communities, what they valued, let's go right into how they related to Australia in particular. That's going to be a point of interest for many here today. One of the major themes that came through was a theme of asymmetry. So actually, first I should say that online survey respondents were asked which country is PNG's best friend, right? And the vast majority said Australia. If pressed to answer a question like that in those terms, they would say Australia is PNG's best friend. But there's complexity to that. And as you look into the themes of what people wrote and said in the interviews that you and your team conducted, Landry, this sort of asymmetry, a very striking asymmetry comes out. So yes, we're best friends, but it's not necessarily an equal type of friendship. And of course, PNG is receiving many, many millions of dollars in Australian aid, but it's not equal in other ways. Do you want to touch on some of the other ways that there was this asymmetry in the relationship?
Most of the surveys, the respondents actually, when we asked them about the friendship or the relationship, they were saying that Australia was our closest friend, which most of them said it. But having also said that, one of the things that they said was, like the Australians working in Papua New Guinea, one of them said that we actually do the same job, but they're paid high money, like the remuneration is higher than some of us, which was a bit of concern for him. But then he actually also said a positive thing when he said that if I was actually going to work in a different place, not directly under an Australian, I couldn't be promoted like now I am promoted and being paid. So in a sense, it was both positive and negative. And he said they got cars, but it's okay. They're coming from different place to us. So it's okay for them to have, well, we can walk home. So, and the other one important point they said was when Australians sending, they want the staff come to Papua New Guinea to look at in terms of the projects and all that. They're sending most of them junior staff, and the junior staff are talking with the high level delegates here in Papua New Guinea, which they thought was not right. They should talk at that senior level, like the Australians. They should come and talk with them at that level. So that was one point they said was not right. And the other one was a couple of them made a very important point saying that Papua New Guineans, we love rugby league. And we don't have a lot of Papua New Guineans playing in NRL. Only one of few people actually was able to break through. But when you look at in terms of the other Polynesian countries, most of them are playing down there. So they thought, well, it was very unfair that in terms of the visa and all that, they are allowed EC access, while Papua New Guineans, we don't have that access. So having on the other side saying being friends, but is it really, do they really mean it when they don't allow us in the sense that they accept the other Polynesians to go in there?
Yeah, thank you. On the visa matter, I mean, that came up a number of times. So National Rugby League did come up a number of times as well in the online survey. That was sort of a sticking point for many. I think one person said, no disrespect to the other Pacific nations, but what's happening here? So on the visas, this was very striking to people, not in terms of comparing PNG with other Pacific islands as how they relate to Australia, but really comparing the way Australians get to PNG and the way Papua New Guineans get to Australia. What do people say there?
Actually, they respectfully say that when Australians come to Papua New Guinea, they're given visa on arrival. Whereas some of us have to wait for 4 or 5 months to get our visa. So it was kind of a bit unfair. That's what they said.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you for all that. Moving to development, and I think that there was a strong, so what I saw in the report was that there was a strong recognition of Australian aid and development funding among educated and urban respondents. Could you talk about the perceptions of how equally that was distributed perhaps outside of those urban centers?
Yeah, definitely. They actually made a mention that the development projects, the funding that are coming into Papua New Guinea, is when you look at it in terms of those, the 120 respondents from the rural Morobe, they were saying that they have no road access, they have no hospitals. So actually, in terms of that, they said that they don't have any access to any funding that is coming from Australia to the rural enclaves where 87% of our Papua New Guinea is made up of. So most of them were saying that if there is development grants being given, it's only concentrated within the urban areas. So the rural enclaves, it doesn't actually reach them. I remember, Leonid, on one of your conversations, he said that one of the respondents said, we actually don't know what is Australian aid. She was confused.
Australian aid long 1M or something like that, yeah.
Yes, so in that sense, you could see that most of what the development projects are centered around in the cities or the main centers. And also, mostly in Ley, they said they're very thankful for the project of Angao project that is actually coming on the redevelopment and the renovation that is now going. It's about 500 million. Some of the mothers said that, oh, I actually delivered my baby, and it was said, I thought I went into an hotel room. Unlike the previous, it got about 4 or 5 kids. Big experience of the previous and the current one, I thought I was delivering my baby in an hotel room. So that was a very positive response, kind of having that experience. So in a way, it was also positive as well.
Yeah, thank you. And so that's the new Australian funded Angao Hospital in Ley, which came up a number of times in those interviews in Ley. It's like, yeah, thank you. Actually, Londa, was something that you said earlier. Maybe we could return to that. So you had mentioned something about the nature of the friendship and whether it's an equal sort of friendship, and something that did come through when a few people sort of voluntarily compared the way they felt Australia was relating to PNG to ways that they thought others related to PNG. And I think this happened on, I remember some of Leonie's focus group discussions, it happened on a personal scale. So people would talk about how they had compare their experience working with Australians to their experience working with somebody Japanese or French or German. But then it also happened, I think in the interviews and the online survey, at a national level where people perceived that the government of Australia was relating to the Papua New Guinean government in a different way than, say, the Chinese government or another Asian government was relating to them. Do you want to expand on that a little bit?
Oh yeah, most of the respondents actually said that especially the Asians, when they deal with the Papua New Guineans, they deal with them on a respect basis, saying that they look at Papua New Guinea as an independent state, as an equal partner. Whereas Australian, they kind of say that they don't treat us the same as the other Asian countries do. If they want to do something, they would actually aggressively come through, and if it means to go to the top level, even instead of going through the process, the Australians couldn't do that. They'll have to go up there, and by all means, they have to get approval or whatever that they wanted to get. So in that sense, it's kind of disrespectfulness for our processes and systems in Papua New Guinea, whereas the other countries are able to respect us in terms of such dealings, and they respect our sovereignty as well. So that was kind of a response most of them we had. Yeah.
Yeah, and I remember some of the some people sort of framed it in terms of economics and said, well, let's look at what we shouldn't look at historical ties to Australia necessarily in terms of who we choose to partner with. It's really about economics and who gives us the better deal, and this sort of thing. So it's sort of a cold, hard deal for us as well. And we shouldn't necessarily be beholden to Australia because of our historical closeness or something.
And actually what they also said was PNG is a different country culturally, linguistically, whatever the things that works in Australia will never work in Papua New Guinea. We have a different, every system is very different. So we can only do what we can do best in Papua New Guinea. So we need to find a model for us, the Melanesian way of doing things. So Australia needs to support us on those, rather than pushing through what they think can work in Australia, can also work in PNG. So they said it doesn't happen that way because of the diversity of our culture that we have in Papua New Guinea. That was, most of the responses were like that.
Yeah, so there was this idea, I remember, of we want to develop, but we want to develop with maintaining our values, maintaining our land in our way, in our the way that we want. We don't want to copy Australian society. We want to continue to be Melanesian and yet develop. Another thing that people really wanted for the future was they really wanted PNG to be manufacturing its own things, again, so that they be cheaper, but also employ people. And so they wanted people to be self-sufficient and self-reliant. And there were some criticisms actually of the Australia Awards Tertiary Scholarships Program that Australia offers in terms of the restrictions on subject matter and how that might be holding Papua New Guinea back from in the future training all of its own people. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, actually what some of the respondents, what they said was Australia needs to do more in terms of training us. They need to train us in terms of the need area. Actually, there are a lot of good things in terms of the scholarship that is given to Papua New Guinea, but we need to train our Papua New Guineans to actually build roads. We need to train them to trade certificates where they can become good builders. They can become good people who can make bridges. So specifically, those areas need to be prioritized also. And also what one of the respondents said was they need to train us as well. Don't give us the degree and just let us come back to PNG without training us. They need to give those specific trainings as well so that it can be able to help us come and develop our own country too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really interesting point. So it's not just go right back as soon as you have your diploma. It's about staying and actually applying it in the workplace afterward. Is that right? Yeah. I think we may have time for one more short topic or question before we move on to bringing Ian Kemish into the discussion. What about let's say the perceptions of or the awareness of the kind of work that Australia is doing in Papua New Guinea? Again, Papua New Guinea is where the majority of Australian aid funds go. Are all areas in Papua New Guinea aware of this? So I think in the remote villages, for instance, it seemed that they had a stronger sense of what, as they said, China, which could refer to many Asian countries as well, was doing in Papua New Guinea, and not so much certainty about what Australia was investing or doing in Papua New Guinea. Do you have a sense of, from the interviews especially, of where that disconnect comes from? Again, why are people in the rural areas not aware of Australia's investment in PNG?
I think what basically the rural 87%, the development is actually lacking. So in a way, they don't see anything, even the government projects as well as the Australian projects. So what they do is they look at the government to help them. So Australian government project funding is not heard of because maybe because they don't know, maybe because they're not informed, or maybe because the projects actually doesn't reach the people back in those rural places. As to the Chinese, when you come to PNG, you'll come to find out that 8 towns in PNG will have a Chinatown. And most, when they come, they actually, if some even Asians are actually with the villages in the villages. So the presence is more than when you look at Australia. So maybe they want to see actually what the Australian the projects need to go back to those rural villages and then tell them that this is an Australian funded project. So maybe in a way they might be able to understand it, but for now, no, based on the survey.
Yeah, thanks so much. I think when one person even described that as, in the online survey, described it as assisting PNG at an arm's length. And
yes,
Londari might be experiencing a power blackout right now. If he has to go, then we understand. But we'll hope to keep you a little bit. But let me bring let me bring Ian Kemish again, Australia's former High Commissioner to Papua New Guinea. Let me bring Ian into the conversation, if we could. Hi,
Hannah. Yeah, and thanks so much. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. I guess it's such an honor for us to be able to get some feedback from you on this report. You've read it. You've had a lifetime of association with PNG. Were there any findings in the report that surprised you or stood out as particularly important?
Look, several findings have stood out as very important to me, and just listening to Londari just now, I'm struck too by the actually very constructive and respectful tone that's reflected in both in the feedback and in the way, Londari for his part has been describing it. It reminds me of a few things. Could I actually just say up front though, Hannah, I just think that the authors and the supporting individuals from both sides of the Torres Strait involved in this deserve quite serious congratulations. I think you've produced something really quite important. And isn't it a great time right now to be talking about listening to Pacific voices? I'm sure many, particularly the Australians, will have been listening to the colourful rhetoric from our politicians over the course of the last several days and weeks. Anyone would be forgiven for thinking we're in the middle of an election campaign. But one of the core things that I have been thinking about as I've been listening to all that is, well, what about the Pacific voices? What about the voices from our friends in Papua New Guinea? What evidence is there that we're listening? And look, my own view is that for a start, Australia shouldn't run around with its hair on fire every time it receives criticism or constructive feedback from the region, and nor do I think that it's reasonable for Australians to pin responsibility only on our elected representatives. There's a national responsibility here for engaging with Papua New Guinea above all, along with the rest of the Pacific. It's about the media, it's about sporting clubs, it's about schools and universities. And it's not, and this is an important point, it's not all about the aid program. But look, coming back to your real question, I'm struck by a few things. I'm struck by the reminder about cultural difference. We Australians can sometimes underestimate this point. And it was evident in some of the things Londari was saying. Papua New Guinea is a place where respect for status and achievement is important. And Papua Guineans are very respectful to each other in that sense. The term elite has a completely different meaning and understanding and nuance in Papua New Guinea to in Australia. And we have a certain culture in Australia that where we're quite keen to get to a point of familiarity very quickly. And we like to speak, we pride ourselves, I think, on speaking kind of equally, no matter what sort of level you are in society. You can turn up at a pub and slap the Prime Minister or opposition leader on the back and call him mate. You just can't do that in Papua New Guinea. It's disrespectful. And we can underestimate that. So that's one of the really useful reminders that comes out of this. I also think that the core point is that is a reminder not to believe our own rhetoric. We are a significant player, to use that term, in the region and in Papua New Guinea, but we really shouldn't get carried away with the size of our aid program, because again, this is a very strong personal view. Aid programs are not the sum total of a relationship. Aid programs don't buy influence. And by the way, no country ever achieved economic development off the back of an aid program. So let's not let that discussion distort things too much. I think about the point is about being visible. That's a key point that emerges from this. Not to make excuses. I mean, we need to focus on that point, I believe, and I think we should be doing a little more infrastructure here in key points as Australia. But part of the constraint is that the Australian aid program only exists with the permission of the Papua New Guinean government, and it can only be channeled in ways that the Papua New Guinean government supports and approves of. So reaching in sometimes with direct impact, visible stuff is actually constrained by the views of the Papua New Guinean government itself. And there's also, and this is a long-running argument, there's also a view that supports the thinking behind the Australian aid program, that it's got to be sort of long-term systemic, that you've got to look at capacity, you've got to build systems, ensure that structures are right, make sure people get paid, all that kind of thing. That sort of thing is not very visible, or that drugs are supplied and provided across the country. It's not easy to put a big Australian flag on that. So that's part of the constraint that aid policymakers face. Nonetheless, visibility is a key point, and I think that if the aid program is going to have the support, respect, and appreciation of our partners in Papua New Guinea, it should be visible. And yes, Australian policymakers are going to have to listen to other voices as well as Papua New Guinean voices, but I think there's a key message there, and that is be more visible. Cut me off if you'd like. I've just got one other point to make, though, Hannah, and that is this difference between elite and rural, if I can put it that way, feedback. That bit was not surprising to me. I'm not at all surprised. I knew actually that criticisms and sometimes resentment of Australia's approach tends to be more concentrated in Papua New Guinea's urban centres, and that it's less true in urban Papua New Guinea. And look, my own experience is that the view at grassroots level is actually less complicated. People are much more focused on the practical benefits where they can see it of the aid program, and in areas where they are directly impacted by something clear and visible. Angar's not a bad example. Tends to be quite appreciated, and if it's a community hall or a school or a road, then that's great. And often, while people might not have a great sense of visibility in some parts of the country, nor have they heard of terms like boomerang aid. which is, I have to say, a bit of an age-old perception of senior public servants in Port Moresby, which, you know, I think there needs to be a doubling down on the messaging around that, around the perception. Finally, just on Asian versus Australian approaches and attitudes, I think there's a lot in what was just said about the visibility in the regions of the Chinese community. And, you know, that Chinese community, some of which dates back to the 1870s in Papua New Guinea, tends to be kind of conflated a bit with more recent Chinese arrivals, and then the SOEs in the Chinese state. It's all sort of a bit put together in people's minds. And that, I think, affects the overall approach. Anyway, I should stop and let you take over.
I was just going to ask you, maybe I'll just ask you one follow-up, Ian, if that's okay. And so you talk about listening, and we need to listen and that sort of thing. How do you really do that on, how would you do that here in Australia? I mean, how would you begin to listen? So we've got this report and we have some quotes in there, but that's not the sum total. And as we say, it's far from representative. We can't claim representativeness, of course. So how would you sort of listen? Would you listen to leading intellectuals from PNG? How would this go forward then? Building listening capacity here, I guess, in Australia.
Yeah, look, I think it'd be a mistake to only listen to intellectuals, to be honest, and to the elite, because, you know, that I'm not sure they're representative of the broader national view. I mean, I actually think it's a really good question, and irrespective of who wins government on May the 21st, I think that there needs to be a moment of reflection about how we do this work. I think that the message has got through, perhaps for all the wrong reasons, that a business as usual approach no longer works, and that we need to do a rethink. You've just produced a report at just the right time, and, you know, I think that the Institute, for its partner supporters, should be actually looking to get this in front of policymakers, even if it's not just the detail. Your own point, you can't pretend that it's fully representative. It's the underlying point about stopping listening and having a think, because we are approaching a moment, irrespective of what government comes to power, where there will be a strategic rethink about the region. And gosh, it'd be a mistake if it was not informed by the voices of the region.
Thanks, Ian. So thank you both. I think we've come to the time in this webinar where we will take a few questions through the chat. And the first question I have is, so far, PNG has been a small player in terms of labor mobility programs, so SWP, PLS, PALM, for a number of reasons. What was the perception of research participants as to the significance of these schemes and any opportunities they might provide? Do you want to touch on that, Londari? I don't know if people in the interviews talked about these schemes, again, working in Australia. Oh, you're muted, Londari.
Sorry, I didn't hear the question well.
So these are labor mobility programs. So again, people being able to work short-term in Australia.
I mean, the point I was making about the scholarship, actually, when the interviewees, I mean, the participants were saying that they give us the degree, and you also give us some experience and skills as well, in terms of giving us the experience so we can be able to come and make use of those. The current mobility, or the seasonal thing that has been actually going down there, people actually benefiting individually. But we need to go back and see actually what is actually happening at the back of those farms and all that. A bit of experiences that has actually happened as well. But what mostly the respondents actually said was they need to get this experience too, in terms of carpentry, in terms of building the bridges, in terms of engineering, those practical things, because we need to build our country with those practical things instead of giving us things, giving us a degree and sending back us to PNG.
Yeah, thank you. I think there were a couple of participants who were responses, either it was interviews or online, I remember, who said they wished they could find some sort of seasonal work in Australia and they weren't aware of any opportunities for this for themselves. So these are people, even there was somebody who was a geologist who actually had a coffee farm operation in his home village. And he said, I'd really like some seasonal work opportunities in Australia. I don't get enough income and I don't know where to find this. So this sort of comment came up. Okay, we'll take another question. We hear a lot about friendship between PNG and Australia, but how is this really sustained from the ground up at the everyday level? So let's say, I'm not sure if this is talking about how should it be sustained or how is it sustained, but maybe we can talk about how this is evident, how this was evident to people. So when people were giving proof of this best friend relationship, Londre, what kind of things were they talking about?
As I was saying, Australia being the very closest neighbor, maybe the only, it is definitely our friend indeed. Actually, they give us the HAID program. For me, I was in Australia studying for 4 years, so I have a lot of friends down there. So in that relationship, yes, it is our friend. But if Australia is actually, from the survey that they give respondents, if they are really serious about thinking in terms of the friendship and trying to help us, they need to seriously think rural instead of looking in terms of the urban areas, because the 87% of our people live in the rural areas. So that is where we need help and support rather than in the rural areas. I mean, in the urban areas. So then, and then also, as they were saying, the presence, I mean, most of them was actually saying that, yes, Australian were our good friends. So that will actually live on. But also, just one important point. One of the interviews actually got up and said, in Canberra, when he was down there, he was down there, young man got up and said, where you from? And they said, oh, I'm from Papua New Guinea. And he said, oh, you from Africa? Like the country in Guinea? And he said, no, I am from the very closest friend, your closest neighbor of Papua New Guinea. And the young man growing up in Australia doesn't know PNG. Whereas we went to school, we were told that your friend is Australia, the closest neighbor. So as Papua New Guineans, we know Australia is our closest neighbor. So we need to do more. That's what I'm thinking.
And I remember, Londre, could you quickly say there was a suggestion from one of your interviewees, I remember, about a follow-up project that relates to our discussion with Ian as well. So the follow-up sort of counterparts.
Yeah. Yeah. One of them could have, one of the person could have said, now that the perceptions about Papua New Guinea towards Australia, maybe we should also do a research about Australians' perception to Papua New Guinea. And then we actually find out how they feel about us. Do they really know us? And I said, we need to do that follow-up research if there are any opportunities later on. That's what I said.
Thank you. Maybe we might have time for a couple more questions. There were some findings regarding condescension. How is that experienced by people who contributed to research? So this idea that there was a condescending attitude towards PNG by either Australia as a nation or Australians in PNG or in Australia. And I think one condescension, I should just say, was a theme. And so we had our team, Mahalopa Lavale and Kelly Samoff, who were coding a bunch of the online surveys. So condescension is, again, a theme. And so it would cover a number of different statements that related to sort of a sense of condescension towards PNG. But do you have any stories to relate about how particular people experienced this, Mondari?
What does that means?
So it was this idea of looking down on PNG, or I think sort of this idea that PNG can never develop and is Papua New Guineans are incapable. That was also sort of encompassed in it.
Well, actually, what I said was PNC, because of the diversity of we have 1,000 tribes and different languages, and as Ian was saying, that the cultural diversity is something that we need to look at, very important. Even when even Australia or any other country wants to help us, we need a Melanesian way of developing our country, our own way. We can't be able to understand that what happens in Australia, or what the development model they use, is what going to apply in PNG. So most of them, the views were that we need to do our way to help develop our country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there were some. I remember, I think it was a young interviewee from the Ley area had said, had described this experience of this mismatch with an Australian boss coming in and not quite sort of, he felt, trying to impose foreign values and unwanted kind of foreign ideas of relating to people on this project that they were doing together. That speaks to that. Okay, I'll just check the Q&A again. We've actually got a question for Ian on your point about the visibility of Australian aid. How do you think the risk can be managed of DFAT officers becoming too focused on branding transactional aid to increase visibility rather than focusing on that deeper, more intangible, transformative collaboration you mentioned that is less easy to promote?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's a difficult balance to strike. In my observation, what tends to happen is that the DFAT practitioners are more focused on the systemic and the long term, and are less interested in branding. It kind of tends to be the politicians who like to push the branding pretty hard. But it is a balance to strike. These issues have been debated for a long time in the relationship between Australia and Papua New Guinea, and if it was easy, we wouldn't be having these discussions anymore. What's new though about this situation, or we've got some nice fresh raw data from the people of Papua New Guinea about these things. I think that the aid program needs to be a blended program which keeps a pretty strong focus on the long term and on capacity development, but which also has a capacity to focus on addressing immediate short-term problems with the permission and support of our partners in Papua New Guinea. And COVID has been an example of that. And there are some pressing education problems where sometimes a bit of reaching forward is required. I also think that a good balance between rural and urban is important. I think that a degree of visibility is very important. So I think it needs to be all these things. But it's a pretty big envelope, and I think that's possible. If I might, though, just going back to one of the earlier questions about, what makes up the relationship. I understood that the question was about, how people felt about these issues. But I guess my reminder to myself and to everybody is that, I don't believe that anyone in Papua New Guinea really sees the aid program as the sum total of the relationship. And, you know, I think some of the questioning was about the aid program, and that's sort of where we've guided our thinking. But the actual reality is that the national links, trading, education, all that other stuff, dwarfs some of the official relationship, and we do need to think about the relationship in much broader terms than this component of the official relationship.
Thank you. We've got a couple questions, particularly to Londari. One is derived from the summary of findings. Do you know how the remote Morobe villagers, for instance, have developed a strong knowledge about Chinese investments in PNG in comparison to Australian investments?
I think it's basically what most of the respondents, when they look at the questions when they were asked, they said that every day you find Asians or Chinese on the streets of Monrovia doing things, and especially when an Australian comes, you might not be able to do that. So maybe physically looking at them might also tell about the presence of Chinese. Mostly people will say that even if it's a Korean man, or even it is from Philippines, they will say more China. Okay, so the presence of Asians is actually felt on the ground. They actually typically see them, and then the Australians on the other end. Actually, so that's what I think.
We've got another question that's very similar. Why is it that Australians do not establish shops and partnerships in rural areas with Papua New Guineans as Chinese do? I suppose this is sort of an open question. I don't know. I guess Ian, do you want to speculate on that one, or?
Look, I think that you know, it goes to the nature of the Chinese population in Papua New Guinea. I mean, you have, particularly with more recent arrivals, you have people who are coming to Papua New Guinea looking for opportunity, and in the Australian case, the sorts of interests that come to bear are people who are motivated by other things. They may be looking for profit and benefit, and so, you know, Australian commercial interests are engaged in Papua New Guinea. Trukai Rice, for example, a significant distributor of rice in the country, ultimately is an Australian operation. It goes to the nature of the relationship, and the history of the relationship, and there's not a lot you can really do about that.
Yeah.
In my view.
We've got another question. I'm interested in any particular views that may have come through regarding China as opposed to an Asian overview, or presumably sort of Asians in general. One was just mentioned, would appreciate more. I might just take that one. I think that in the research, there were a few people who mentioned Japanese development projects in particular, but really my sense, and Londra, you can correct me if I'm misremembering this, my sense is that there wasn't much differentiation between, so sometimes China was, particular Chinese projects would be mentioned, and they're particularly Chinese. So in some cases, it was clear that China as a nation or Chinese nationals were being described. In other times, people would use the word Asian. Sometimes, again, Japanese development projects were mentioned, but I can't remember any particular respondents who actually differentiated between a way that Filipinos or Japanese or Malaysians or other nationals or nations related to PNG, as opposed to China, where they really picked that apart and were comparing those. So either they were talking about one particular nation, or they were comparing between an Asian country or various Asian countries and, say, Australia. That's my memory. I don't remember if you have any particular instances of that, Londari, in the interviews where people were contrasting between two or more different Asian countries.
Actually, the questions were not the questions were not actually being specifically asked on about the or Chinese or Filipino, but they were just, the questions were more focused for Australia. But when we actually asked them about any in comparison to Australia, the first thing that come out of the respondents were Chinese. So yeah, so that's how actually it came, but there was no specific comparisons.
Thanks so much. And thank you very much, Ian, for joining us. I know you're going to have to drop out a little bit early. Thank you so much to everyone. First of all, everyone who attended today. Thank you for all of our panelists, and thank you for all of our collaborators. Thanks to the Whitlam Institute for hosting this research. Please look up the report. It's on whitlam.org, and keep the conversation going. Thank you so much and have a good night.